Hi, Next Economy Now listeners. In celebration of our second cohort of Next Economy Living beginning this October, we're launching a special mini-series on the podcast to explore ways to build our individual and collective resilience strategies during these critical times. If you enjoy this episode and are excited about designing your life in alignment with your values in a supportive community environment, consider joining our fall cohort of Next Economy Living. In this 6-month learning journey, we'll learn how to deepen our security and resilience practices to thrive and flourish amidst ecological and economic challenges. Learn more and sign up for a free coffee chat with one of our facilitators at bit.ly/Next Economy Living.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, my name is Erin Axelrod, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy, and I'm so excited to welcome Jewel Pearson to Next Economy Now. Jewel is a tiny house expert, intentional living advocate, and longtime voice for representation in the tiny house movement. A 10-plus year tiny house dweller, she brings lived experience and deep expertise to her work as a consultant, educator, and speaker. Jewel challenges the status quo of community, housing, and traditional wealth building, helping others design self-defined homes and aligned lifestyles rooted in values rather than square footage or status. Through consulting, workshops, and speaking, she supports individuals on their journey to intentional living while guiding the creation of communities grounded in sustainability, equity, and representation, communities that are resilient and address collective needs. Her work reimagines tiny homes as infrastructure for systemic change and as a platform for including those too often left out of housing conversations. Jewel, it's such an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you. I am very pleased to be here.
So Jewel, to kick us off, can you share a little bit first about kind of who you are and a little bit about, from an economic standpoint, what was your life like that contributed to you making the decision to go tiny?
Absolutely. So I am a 10-plus year tiny house on wheels dweller, and I built my house in 2015, started researching around 2013. I built my house at a time when tiny houses weren't a known thing and people just thought I was a weirdo. I still say that I probably am a little bit weird, but it was something prior to the big phenomenon that they are now. I now fashion myself so I designed my house, sourced all the material for my house, worked with my builder, did all of the things. Building at that time was very different than building right now. A lot fewer resources, so which is why it took the research so long. But being very involved in the build of my tiny house, and at that time also thinking that I was joining a movement that was changing the status quo of housing and realizing that that really wasn't what my counterparts were doing, kind of has led me into the path where I am now. And so now I fancy myself as a lifestyle architect and strategist, a longtime advocate for intentional living, very heavy on representation in the movement. And so, yeah, that's kind of like who I am and where I see myself. Coming into the movement, this was something that I had known. Living small was something I had known I wanted to do since my daughter was going into kindergarten, which was in the early 90s. And that came about as being a young single mom and the hardship, the stress. I've always said, being a young single mom, all of my decisions had to be made by requirements, like needs, requirements, less on wants, and just having to be very responsible. And at that time, I knew I wanted to get to a point later in life, once I'd raised my daughter and she was kind of going off to do her thing, I wanted to have the opportunity to be irresponsible. And so for me, early on, I saw that then as living in an RV and traveling. And we started talking about that. She and I started talking about that in kindergarten, and kind of had a conversation with her, like, you've got to do well in school, because when you're done, you got to buy me an RV. And so it kind of morphed from that. And then as she was going into undergrad, 2005 is when I really started realizing, like, I'm getting to that point. So started my downsizing and looking into what that would look like. And then it transitioned from an RV to a tiny house on wheels. And this is my non-traditional retirement plan, is the way I've spoken about it. Having, worked in corporate America, but not from the perspective of, always having the growing 401k. When you're younger, you're not necessarily focused on all of those things. And that hasn't been my ministry to have all of that set up from a financial perspective. So the tiny house is my way of backing into non-traditional retirement.
Such deep appreciation for your leadership. One of the projects that we work on at Lift Economy is called the Next Egg, and it's an alternative to traditional retirement savings, a community of practice thinking about that, because not only are they sometimes unattainable for many folks,
Right.
they're also, paradoxically, when we look at, the fiduciaries managing those 401ks, many of those funds are paradoxically undermining the very livable future we need to retire to.
Agree. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. A conundrum of sorts.
So you're way ahead of a lot of the awareness curve in terms of your taking action early on to innovate other ways of meeting your needs.
And it really came about as survival, which happens for a lot of us. Like, you don't really have the plan. It's just about surviving.
Looking back on the decision now, I'd be curious your thoughts around the experience of it as a vehicle for being more in integrity with your values or with your life's purpose.
Absolutely. I offer workshops, and one of the things that I share in the workshop, because going into building it, it was so much for me at that time just about the house. That was what was offered, learning about the house, how to build a house, systems, the systems, the structure, all of that. And then as I built my house and the changes that started happening with me around intentional living and the lifestyle, and there were so many changes for me, people, places, and things. People around me changed as I made these decisions. I became more focused on my footprint in the world. There was obviously your downsizing to live in a smaller space, but my awareness, as I was saying, like my footprint in the world, my awareness of downsizing from the perspective of the things that I love and want to have near versus I'm getting down to 10 shirts, or like it became more, the intentionality became more important. And so the thing that I have shared and I share in my workshops is that it's really so much more than just about the house. It's about clarity. It's about alignment. For me, it's been about liberation. And that has been a major shift from how I started initially to where I am right now and the work that I do right now. My house changed me. And I want people to be aware of that and not be surprised And so in my workshops, like if I always say that, if you know things are coming, you can be prepared to deal with them. And so some of it for me was surprising. Like, as I say, people, places, and things, as people shifted around me based on decisions that I was making for my life. I wasn't ready for that. And sometimes I was trying to hang on to those people and not understanding like the how and the why. Why are these people shifting, and not recognizing that was a necessary shift for where I needed to go. And I want people to be aware going into it that that's upcoming.
You hit on something I was going to go to next, which is because I live in a tiny house. This is really personal for me. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the aspect of community in your life, because you mentioned that's such a core part of your work. And sometimes my experience of tiny house living, at least in the so-called US where land access can be really tricky, sometimes it inadvertently contributes to isolation and perpetuation of the nuclear family. Absolutely. So could you talk about that tension and how you've been able
to? Absolutely. And that's a big thing because, as you said, we're fighting against systems who don't want to recognize tiny houses on wheels as legitimate housing options. So I agree with that 100% because where I have had to, because I live in a gray area, is what I say. I live in a gray area. So it's not technically legal. It's not technically illegal, but I also don't advertise, where I am and what I'm doing. And so because of that, I have had to be isolated. And as a Black woman in the movement, it has been even more. My very first location for my tiny house was an RV park, where, neighbors and things, I had people around. And very soon thereafter, I started experiencing problems with racism, which is oftentimes entrenched in RV parks. And I always laugh and say, just for a few minutes, I had forgotten I was a Black woman. I was just in the tiny house movement, living in a tiny house. And then it's like, okay, I hadn't factored this in. So then I had to move my house from the RV park, and I was in someone's backyard, but I had to be kind of in the suburbs and out. And so there was that where I first started experiencing that isolation. And for me, the challenge at that point was the adjusting to this new way of living in a tiny house. And now I'm outside of all of the things that are really my norm. My friends aren't really coming around because I'm outside of this area. And so it was a challenge those first few years in adjusting to everything that was new. The bonus for me was the way I designed my house, and my house is just kind of enveloped me in this cocoon of love. So I had that to lean on. Like, I knew I didn't want to not live in a tiny house, but so that meant I had to figure the other things out. And since that time, I've twice had to move my house because of issues with racism. I've been in out, the areas that are most accepting, and I'm using quote fingers, of tiny houses are RV parks in rural areas. And those aren't the most safe spaces for Black and brown people. And so I've had challenges there from a safety perspective. And so this last year, the last 3, almost 4 years, I was on a friend's farm 45 minutes outside of a major city, and I was the only person out there. But I was safe from the perspective of no one was bothering me. Like, I could live in my house and be there. The city, the municipalities weren't bothering me, but I was so very isolated. And then I experienced a year, 3.5, I experienced a health situation where being isolated, like as it happened and I was isolated, it terrified me because there was nobody I could reach out to for help. And so that piece of it, as much as over the years, I have developed a big online community, but still when you're talking about like physical community, because of the challenges with tiny houses, that piece is often missing. And so now I would say I'm more in a suburb that is allowing me more connection, and I have neighbors, and I'm back within distance of friends to visit. And that makes a big difference. Like, you need the physical community. Online is fine. I built a big online community, but you need to be able to connect with people and see people. And that is the challenge when you just want housing, but you have to jump through hoops to have housing because cities and counties don't want to acknowledge the opportunity with tiny houses on wheels. So I feel like that was a lot of words, but I hope I answered your question.
It was an incredible answer, Jewel, in terms of what you alluded to that I think is often left out of the discussion are the invisible systems that really are consequential in terms of folks' ability to engage in these types of practices that you and I might describe as critical for creating an economy that works for everyone.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think the piece that, I'll just say it, the injustice that our legal, our political, our municipal systems are so built up to make it so overly complex to actualize something that's different from a standalone nuclear family, single home family vision. So your persistence and dedication is really awe-inspiring, and also sort of grief-inducing that it had to take all of
Yes,
that.
all of that. Absolutely. Absolutely. I just want to live, you know? Yeah.
I want to lift up Oakland, city of Oakland, past this vehicular residential facility that actually permits tiny house communities right in city domain. And
Beautiful.
Of course, there's still barriers, right? Access to capital, the high cost of getting access to those lots. But yeah, I guess, are you seeing hopeful signs around movements or people that are breaking down some of those barriers?
I see a lot of hope, but I see the hope happening on the West Coast. Like you just said, Oakland. The West Coast seems to be leading the charge. As you know, the rules are made at the city and county level. So several cities within California are embracing tiny houses on wheels as opportunities. The East Coast is just really slow to it. And that, to me, is disappointing. We have some tiny house communities, but as far as, like what I was just speaking about, not wanting to, and the communities are, again, RV parks. And so that means from a zoning perspective, they're not within the inner city. So, you got to be out. You've got to be out in a rural area to get to an RV park. So it's still that disconnect for housing. And oftentimes I feel like the good old boy network that exists here in the East and in the South continues to be the barrier for consideration. And, I keep saying, I was in a meeting earlier this week and we were talking about tiny houses, and it's like, it's not impossible. We see that other cities are doing it. It doesn't require you to reinvent the wheel. You can just take these models and use these models. It just requires the initiative and the imagination and the willingness to do something outside of the status quo. Like, the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and over again. And they continue to make the same decisions around housing and the facade of affordable housing, but nothing changes. And so until things are done differently, we won't have any solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm hopeful, but not exactly sure when it arrives here.
I wanted to go back to something you shared, which you mentioned that your home really transformed you.
Absolutely.
And I was curious if there are stories or examples that you could share with our listeners that you recall that sort of kind of paint that picture for our listeners around how that transformation happened or what it looked like.
Absolutely. So one of the bigger things that I share is I've always loved to travel, but I had always been the traveler that's going to have the big suitcase. I might get to the airport and they have to put the heavy sticker on my suitcase. And, for a week's travel, got the heavy suitcase, all the shoes, all the things. And transformation happened I'm not exactly even sure when and how it happened, but the next thing I knew was I am the traveler that I'm team carry on, or I'm the backpack traveler. Like I can travel with a backpack for an extended stay. And it was like just a natural transition. It just made sense. And so that was, sometimes I was like, I don't even know who I am to be able to the lightness. But I've always said I imagined my tiny house journey as living a lighter, freer lifestyle. And so the extension of travel has become that as well, because it's lighter and it's freer. And it just makes sense that I don't travel with a lot of things because that's not my thought process. Now, I'm not a minimalist. I always say I'm not a minimalist. I believe in having the things that you love in your home, and that's represented in my house. But it is the things that I love. It is the constant of, I've always been a shopper. I'm not the shopper anymore like I used to be, but I don't deprive myself, but I'm very conscious about if I'm, bringing something in, something generally is going out. Shoes, if I spend money on shoes, it's shoes I usually have for years, but, I pay more money to have shoes that are going to last for years. I'll, buy several colors of that same shoe. It's more of and it's not even a thinking, like I'm really thinking to do it. It is just something that has naturally started happening. And I remember a friend of mine early on, and not a close friend, but someone who knew me early on. She was like, I know you like to shop. I can't imagine that you're going to be how you're going to live in a tiny house. And I've never forgotten that. But the transformation has just happened. Additionally, one of the things that I started thinking about when I lived on the farm, I became really more focused on what I was eating, what I was putting in my body. And I was like, you can't really live on a farm and, see God's work all around you and just still be focused on trash, as far as your eating habits. And so it's just things like that, the intentionality that becomes part of who you are naturally. And again, as before you know it, you've just changed overall.
I sometimes joke when people ask me how big my tiny house is. I'm like, well, I mean, global standards, it actually isn't very tiny, right? It's 28 by 8 and 240 square feet. Like that's actually pretty large for many communities.
Right.
I'd be curious your comments on just like size. You mentioned you're trying to work with people to move beyond square footage, but do you have any thoughts on or stories of how that's landed when you talk to people about the small square footage, quote unquote?
Yeah. So when I building in 2015, the mindset about tiny houses, especially for the people who were in the movement, was very different. And as much as they wanted the world to allow them to live in tiny spaces and not dictate what they did, there were so many rules within the tiny house community. You didn't build over a certain size. And around that time, they were building the 18-foot and the 20-foot was, just kind of pushing it. And there were a lot of thoughts around, you had to be a minimalist. You only have, this number of pans and this, 4 forks, if it's a family of 4, stuff like that. And I always say that wasn't my ministry. I have lived in very nice spaces and I've never wanted to feel like I was giving anything up to live tiny. I also knew I was kind of older than a lot of the people in the movement, and thinking about this from the retirement perspective, I didn't want to feel like I was moving into a box, and that would have made me unhappy and it would not have been sustainable. And so I was kind of quiet about what I was building because there was a lot of judgment within the movement. But the tiny house itself is 28 feet, 8'6" wide. And when I first built it, I also had a 8-foot screened-in porch, a collapsible screened-in porch, and a Juliet balcony off of my loft. And it was just like, this is my house. This is my money. You all can't tell me how I need to build my house. I'm doing something different. And then my design, I had a closet in my house, and I have a nice size bathroom and things, again, that were designed for me, but they weren't really seen in the movement at that time because they were, the storage up underneath the couch and that kind of stuff. That's where you put your clothes. And I was like, no, I need a closet, and I want a real couch, a comfortable couch. And so I felt like I was coming in bucking the norms, but for long term, this was important to me. And I felt like if we're asking municipalities and folks to allow us to live in our houses, then you also should be allowing people who are building their houses to build a tiny house for them that works for them. And it doesn't have to be so many rules around you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. And so that's how I built my house. And then since that time, I have added on a sunroom space. I have a screened-in porch. And so the original tiny house, so I have two lofts. The original tiny house is like what you're saying, 240 square feet of, you want to count the overhead lofts, you add that in. With the sunroom space, it is, including the lofts, it's right around 460 square feet. Still small by the world standards, but larger in the tiny house movement. But it's my house and it is my sanctuary. And I feel like we get to do what works, for us and what makes us happy. Again, it's still a small footprint. I remember when I added on this space, a woman told me, and my house also appears bigger because I have a lot of windows. And that for me was part of the design. Windows open up a space. And so people are always telling me your house isn't that small. It is. It just doesn't look that way because of the windows. But when I added the sunroom space, I remember this woman sent me a note and she told me I couldn't advocate for tiny houses anymore because my house was no longer tiny. And so I just should stop talking about it. And I was like, you don't get to tell me what I can talk about, but still my house is still small. People are so weird sometimes, but I just believe we get to do what works for us. And their houses, people started building the 40 foot and all of those things. I just believe in letting people live and do what works for them.
Yeah. And those porches are so critical. I love my porch. Oh my goodness, that outdoor space.
Absolutely. Yeah. I remember being in a meetup and one of the guys who was here in the Charlotte area, who was like one of the original tiny house folks, he had built an 18-foot tiny house. And he wasn't a small guy. And we were in a meetup. And a woman asked something along the lines of, how do you not be cramped or whatever in the house? Like, how does that work? And he basically said his house was designed to make him get out in the world. He was like, I'm going to get out in the world and not be in my house so I'm not cramped. And I was like, I took a totally different approach. I don't want to be in my house and feel compelled to need to get out into the world unless I just want to. I don't want my house to feel cramped and then I'm forced to get out into the world. I want home and I want, to be comfortable. So my approach I knew was very different from what I saw, a lot of the early tiny house folks doing.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I'd be curious for you to speak to kind of what you're doing today to grow this movement. You've spoken and taught and you offer workshops. And what are you learning in kind of relating to others who have so much less experience than you in this world? What are you learning and what are your hopes for what those relationships can lead to?
One of the things, and I think it really started clicking for people around COVID and quarantine, was the challenges of being dependent on systems. And that, has continued absolutely to be a current theme. And I think there was, the people that were really, there's that saying how the quarantine and COVID during that time, it was different for different people. And, there were some people who it was like vacation, and then there was some people who were really suffering. Health perspectives, jobs, housing, all of those things. And a light bulb, I think, clicked as I've seen it for people who were then focused on what does it look like in creating our own models of housing, our own models of community, because, then we needed to be more dependent on each other. And what does it look like to create our own model of an economy, because people were having to be more creative with, businesses and services that they were offering, that type of thing. And so I feel like that is a lead in for tiny houses, tiny house communities, the intentional living conversation, and our collective approaches that reduce our dependence on systems that weren't, as I speak to it, that were never really built for a lot of us, myself included. And so I'm really excited about the fact that people are waking up to that idea. And it's not just a foreign concept. And that is the conversation that I have been trying or have been having more with people. It's clicking because, they experienced that time period and recognize how difficult things were. And so it's not, where I'm over here living in a tiny house and doing my own thing. I'm not the weirdo so much anymore. It makes sense. And so that's the work and the connections that I feel that I'm making right now, where I feel like there's a lot of doom and gloom right now. The conversations that I'm having around intentionality and living intentionally in small houses and small spaces and more autonomy is the direction and the work and the conversations that are happening in my world right now. And it's very exciting.
I know we have to wrap up. I could talk to you for days about all this. And as we come to close, I guess my last question is just, you referred to intentional community, and so many of our listeners are really passionate about that. I would love for you to share kind of what you mean by that. I know that's a huge question to end on, but what do you mean by that? And then anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Absolutely. So I think right now, the intentional community, and I kind of started talking about this, as the shift was happening in our political arena, in surrounding yourself with people who sustain you, people who there's reciprocity, there is, like you had mentioned before, the bartering, the people who can keep you going, not just the person that you wave at next door and go on about your business, people that you can depend on, people that you can count on. So intentional community for me refers to, picking and choosing the people that you are in possibly physical community with. And that's my thought process around developing tiny house communities, like-minded people who are, headed in some of the same directions, that are interested in collective and cooperative systems. And then if you can't get to that physical community, at least from a online or the social community perspective, surrounding yourself with people who right now our nervous systems need a lot of support, and being in those spaces that allow you to be well in from a mental, spiritual, all of the perspectives that you're able to take care of yourself. That to me is intentional community, and choosing, those spaces to be in or not to be in.
That was the most incredible definition I've ever heard. Thank you.
Well, thank you, because I felt like I was rambling. So thank you.
No, it struck a chord so deeply with me, and especially the wellness piece. And no small task, right? That's an incredible thing, hard thing to create. Well, anything else you'd like to share with our listeners? I mean, one thing we like to ask is, how can our listeners support you right now?
So I offer consulting, I offer courses, master classes, my planning, what I'm calling a tiny house summit for next spring, early summer. My dream right now, like my major to do, is to build this community, a physical tiny house community. And that is like, that's my big next I want to do. I feel like that's my legacy in the movement, and building it in ways that it's not the traditional dependency on the systems. And that's what I like to do. So if there's somebody out there that is interested in partnering on a tiny house community, a space where people can offer sustainability and affordability and autonomy and all of the things that I feel like the movement represents, I would love to do that. Like, that's my aspirational list, and I want to make that happen. And I'm trying to figure out how to get there.
May it be so.
Thank you.
I want that for you too.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Oh, and the world needs that so badly. So,
we do. We need those spaces so that we can care for ourselves.
Yeah. If only we had an economy that truly was rooted in care as opposed to militarism.
Yeah.
And punitive. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a little bit of hope in that this system just burns itself on out, and then we get to do the things that so many of us want to do. Like, that is the big hope. What's happening isn't working. The ways that we've existed thus far hasn't been working. It leaves so many people out of the conversation. And purposely leaves people out and criminalizes people. And it's just like, we deserve so much better and something different than that.
Absolutely well said. What an incredible note to end on for our listeners. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your dedication, your inspiration. Jewel, it's been such an honor to talk with you today.
It has been an honor to be here. Thank you so much. I love these conversations. I don't want to talk about the paint colors I used and my pillow choices. I want to have these conversations. So thank you.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation and are looking to dive even deeper into the B Corp movement, you'll love our new podcast, Beyond the B, hosted by Lyft Economy's Amy Allison and me, Ryan Honeyman. Beyond the B is your insider's guide to the B Corp movement. You'll learn about the new B Corp standards shaping our community, how the B Corp movement is navigating the various tensions and challenges of growth, and how businesses like Patagonia are putting their commitments to people and planet in practice. Check out our latest episodes and free resources at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can also subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
The deepest takeaway has just been this much more felt sense of possibility and clarity. We deserve this better world, and we're living it now. And when we work together, we have so much power, and there's just so much capacity for really beautiful transformation in like the home, in the workplace, in community spaces, in learning spaces. So I'm really, really glad that I chose to sign up.
You just heard from Emily, a graduate of the Next Economy MBA. If you're interested in creating an organization or vocation that aligns with a world that works for all life, we'd love to have you join our fall cohort beginning September 30th. Our 9-month program is designed to provide an accessible introduction to business and organizational fundamentals from a just and regenerative perspective, based on our work with over 300 social enterprises and 700 alumni who are transforming communities around the world. Learn more and sign up for a free intro session at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Plus, save 20% on tuition through August 11th during our early bird sale. Thanks for listening, and now onto the show.